I should be very brief, but I'd just first of all like to thank Europarörelsen, Katarina and Eva for organizing this seminar on this extremely important and topical issue of energy and the energy market and Sweden, how Sweden couples to that. So with those few words, and also again to thank Elaine O'Connell, who we'll hear from shortly, who is with us from Brussels. So thank you very much, and basically over to Katarina.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for the possibility to be here in the facilities of the European Commission in Stockholm. My name is Katarina Ringborg. I have a background in the Swedish energy industry, and I have assisted the organizers in setting up this program. Electricity supply is often described as a national concern, but in practice, it is a long time since we had a Swedish electricity market. We have had an exchange of electricity between the Nordic countries for a long time, but the trade with electricity and the formation of Swedish electricity prices have, since a long time and to a large extent, been set in an international, on an international market. Sweden has been a net exporter of energy of electricity for a long time. The major part has been exported to Finland, and the major part has been imported from Norway. Sweden is the sixth largest has the sixth largest electricity consumption per capita in the world. So it's kind of logic that when electricity prices started rising last year, we got a public debate focused on those issues that we are going to discuss today. And also the ongoing Swedish chairmanship has focused very much on those issues. With us today, we have three energy professors from three well-known Swedish universities. Thomas Kåberger, you are professor at Chalmers University. You were formerly head of the Swedish Energy Agency, and you have a broad international background. Among other things, you are advising the Japanese government on energy issues. Lennart, you are a professor at the Royal Swedish Institute of Technology. You're an expert on power system technologies, so you know virtually everything about stability, about smart grids, about transformation, and those things that we are going to focus on today. Kajsa, you are a professor at Uppsala University, and in your research, you have been focusing on the other side of the energy system. That is not the production side, but the user side. And industry, of course, is a big user of electricity, but also we, individuals, are fairly large electricity consumers. So we also have a role in the energy system and thereby also an individual responsibility. And last, but certainly not least, Elaine O'Connell is a policy officer dealing with internal market issues at DG Commission in DG Energy in the Commission in Brussels. She will talk about the strategy of the EU Commission. We know that Repower EU is focused on reducing emissions and reducing dependence of Russian energy and reducing dependence on Chinese technology and Chinese industrial capacity. So it will be very interesting to hear her views on what role Sweden might play in that context. So by those words, I leave the word to our first speaker, who will also be our moderator today, Thomas Kåberger.
Thank you, Katarina, and welcome all of you. This topic of energy supply and electricity market regulation in Europe in particular has for many years appeared not so interesting. It has worked well, prices have fallen, everyone has been basically happy with it. I was involved already before I was Director General of the Energy Agency in the Swedish Energikommissionen in the 1990s that gave the final admittance to the electricity re-regulation introducing competition. The basic economics behind this is that by sharing all the generating capacity that is within technical reach in the best possible way by competition, you would minimize the cost of electricity supply. In the 1990s, the situation in Sweden was one where there was overcapacity, and the result was immediately very low electricity prices that customers could enjoy. In the development in the coming 10 years, a lot of power plants were closed because they were not able to earn the money necessary to keep them operating. The European electricity market became more and more integrated. And then in the first 10 years of this century, Sweden became a net importer of electricity. In 2003, Sweden was a net importer, almost 8,000 hours out of the 8,700 hours that year. We enjoyed a lot of low-cost Norwegian hydropower at the time, but also import from other countries. This was considered to be a bit of a problem because as an importer of electricity, you have higher electricity prices than your neighbors, and there was investments starting in Sweden, in particular in wind power, and from the year 2010, Sweden has been a net importer every year, and the number of hours per year where we have imported electricity has decreased, but still we enjoy the opportunity of using power plants in neighboring countries to keep down the electricity supply costs compared to what would be the case if we were trying to solve all the electricity demand in Sweden by power plants within the national borders. Since 2015, there has been quite a dramatic change in the electricity market all over the world because solar and wind power has become much cheaper, and the generating cost of new solar and wind has been lower than not only competing new electricity supply, but we've also seen in many parts of the world that new solar and wind power has outcompeted existing power plants. This has also been to the benefit of the electricity customers, but created a lot of excitement in the industry because of stranded assets, that's power plants in the balance sheets of companies losing value, which resulted in many big power companies reporting great losses in their annual accounts in the years between 2015 and 2020. That was dramatic. That was more exciting than electricity market had been for a long time. But then came 2021 and 2022. And in Europe, that must be the most dramatic challenge to an electricity market that you could have imagined. Now it's easier to imagine because now we've seen it. But what we saw in 2022 was a loss of planned, expected electricity generation from hydropower in Southern Europe by about 60 terawatt hours. And this is among the lowest marginal cost supply that has contributed to continuously or producing when they could at low cost and reducing the total cost of electricity supply in Europe. In addition to that, French nuclear power had a lot of problems, decreasing their supply by about 80 terawatt hours in 2022. France went from being probably the largest electricity exporter in the world in 2021 to becoming a net importer of electricity. And then Russia had invaded the Ukraine. They tried to use their gas supply to Europe as a tool in making Europe less likely to support the Ukraine. And the gas price hit record high levels by a combination of tightening supply and the increased demand that resulted from the loss of hydropower and nuclear power in Europe. So even if prices were high, there was an increase last year in the electricity generation from gas, lignite, and coal in Europe. Solar and wind increased more, but also these fossil fuel-based electricity generators did increase. As a result, electricity prices were very high in Europe. Gas prices were very high, which a lot of households in Europe suffered from significantly. Even in Sweden, in particular in southern Sweden, electricity prices became a lot higher than what we are used to. And we have had a lot of debate in Sweden in particular, but in all of Europe, about the high prices. And as Sweden has been a net exporter and was significantly the largest net exporter of electricity in 2022, there has been a lot of sentiments in Sweden saying we should use our own electricity at low cost before exporting to other countries. And that has resulted in a criticism of how the European electricity market works and the idea of having an open international market. And many of us have been involved in debates about whether the European collaboration in the energy supply area is something that is desirable or not, which is, of course, a matter of whether you are on the exporter side or the importer side. There's also been a lot of disinformation in this area, and one should have in mind the fact that we are in an area where the hostilities between Russia and Europe are intense, and disinformation is something that is pursued. And the idea of creating conflicts within European countries and between European countries in this context is, of course, in the interest of Russia. So we should be skeptical when we see things that are making us very angry or very engaged in this area. And it's important to try to be sure that the numbers and facts and arguments you use are well-founded. While I think most people who know the industry and who understands economics would agree that the marginal cost pricing that is driving the European electricity supply has benefited the efficiency of the allocation of available electricity generating capacity in Europe. There has been a lot of more complicated arguments brought into the discussion. The electricity system is technically quite complicated. I remember many years ago in the Swedish energy conference, which was about the other controversial topic, the nuclear role of nuclear power or not, there was a very experienced energy expert in Sweden who actually had his same supervising professor as I when he got his PhD, who told the audience that if you're about to lose a debate on energy policy issues, just make a statement that contains two erroneous components and no one can defend their position against that two-error argument. Nowadays, I would say if you bring in reactive power and frequency stability, it becomes very difficult to argue because these issues of reactive power and frequency stability, they are a bit scary and you don't really understand them. So you don't really know how to deal with it. But Lennart Söder, who will soon take over the floor, he can do this in detail and he understands it, and you don't get too upset when he is explaining how it actually works. There are also issues about how the balancing market works. How can we cope with electricity systems that include a lot of solar and wind power that are not always producing, but only producing when there is solar or wind energy available, which is very much the same problem as how can we deal with hydropower in seasons where hot and dry weather reduces the generation, or when nuclear reactors close down for one reason or another, or where gas suddenly becomes very expensive. All these things are what the electricity market is designed to actually deal with. And I think we will hear more about that from Lennart and possibly also from Elaine in the, during this seminar. But one of the most important opportunities of the competitive electricity market with marginal cost pricing is that when marginal cost pricing is applied and customers see the marginal cost of generating electricity, we also get the conditions necessary for the customers to actually decide whether the electricity consumption they are about to decide upon is worth the cost of producing the electricity. So this opportunity to weigh the cost of generation against the benefit of consumption is extremely important for the whole system to work efficiently. And during the last year, when electricity prices were terribly high, that did affect electricity consumption. Electricity consumption in Europe did drop significantly. And that was a part of a rational, economically efficient solution to the problem of dramatically increased cost of electricity supply in Europe. It did have consequences. It did have consequences to individual household customers, and it did have some severe consequences to many electricity consuming industries in Europe who had to compete with electricity consuming competitors in other parts of the world where electricity prices did not rise quite as much as they did in Europe. But we should be aware that it was not only Europe that was affected by high fossil fuel prices, so electricity cost did increase in most parts of the world. I once somewhat cynically said that Putin's invasion in the Ukraine has resulted in something that's the closest we've ever been to a global carbon tax, because it did raise the price of fossil fuels all over the world, definitely so in Asia. So what we are going to discuss now first is the issues of the European electricity market regulation in relationship to the actual detailed functioning of the electricity system in detail. And this is important. It is an area where the regulations developing are improving the conditions, but I think we can see that they are not perfect. It is difficult to even imagine that they could be absolutely perfect, but they are so good that it's difficult to find simple suggestions of how to make them significantly better. And it's definitely, as far as I can see it, not an argument against the continued electricity market integration and the idea of a competitive electricity market. But they are important, and as they are important, they should be discussed and developed. The issue of how to weigh the marginal cost of generation against consumption, which Kajsa will talk about, and the incentives for energy efficiency improvements, is also one which is good but not perfect. Many customers are not paying the marginal cost. That may be because they have long-term contracts with fixed prices, which means many of Swedish households and industries did not suffer at all from the very high electricity prices last year. Many of them didn't understand that they had opportunities to renegotiate their contracts and earn money by reducing their electricity use, though such renegotiations of contracts did happen because electricity became more valuable, and if you had a contract to buy it at low price, you could sell it back to the suppliers in many cases. But these issues has also changed, as the old-fashioned idea was that electricity prices were fixed over the year, and the investment decisions was simply one of using more or less electricity. But now, when we have seen that the electricity price, the marginal cost of electricity generation varies significantly over time, it's also a matter of efficiently allocating when are you going to use electricity and when should you not. And you can save a lot of money by reallocating your consumption in time. This understanding has improved dramatically because of the electricity market reform, because data on marginal costs over time has become publicly visible. When I started teaching electricity system economics and functioning at university in the mid-1980s, I had to spend a lot of time being very nice to some people at Vattenfall and other power companies to get tables of marginal costs for different electricity generators, and you never got anything that was more recent than 5 years ago because of that was their economic interest to keep these things secret. Now it has become transparent, and that has resulted in the opportunity for industries and others to actually make more rational decisions, reducing the total system cost. And we see it in the development of the energy strategies of industries now, as they are trying to replace fossil fuels with electricity, and they do it in a way so that they will be able to reduce their total cost by consuming electricity only when electricity is available in large quantities and at low prices, and avoid consuming electricity when electricity is expensive. We see it in, for example, the fossil-free steel industries, where storing hydrogen from periods of cheap electricity to be used in periods of expensive electricity is a way of reducing their cost at the same time as it is a way of balancing the electricity system. So there are significant savings made in the electricity supply cost of Europe with the electricity market regulation now in place. There are still issues, and those will be discussed in the coming presentations. And I will hand over the floor to Lennart Söder first, who is the electricity system expert who can, with confidence and knowledge, explain those things that many find fearful and exciting about frequency stability and reactive power. Good luck, Lennart.
And inertia. Okay, then there was the challenge with this. How did I manage this?
Yeah. Shall I try?
There is some kind of share screen. Ah, there it is. Share. Okay. No.
Ja. Och så startar du bildspel.
Where?
Jag lägger ner.
Okay. Is it possible to get this? Okay, I do it in this way anyhow. Okay, nice to be invited to this. So I will talk about can EU targets and regulations provide stable and reliable electricity. And I think Thomas was completely right that it has been a very much discussion that this is very much a national issue. But there are, of course, connections between the Sweden and the surrounding world, and that is what I will talk about. First, there are two words here. One is the stable. And stable means that you keep the balance from second to second. And I will show you a very small issue with what I mean with that. And then we have this with reliability. And reliable can be very many things. You can get, for example, outages as we had in Stockholm around 2 weeks ago. But here I talk about more something called adequacy, which is that we should have enough power plants in Sweden in order to cover the peak demand. And that is the same issue for every country. And here are regulations around both these things. I will first start to talk a little about electricity, just to make it very simple what electricity is here. You have this, and that is that very simple. This is, you have a torch or you have your cell phone or something. Very simple. And exactly when you push the button, exactly at that millisecond, power goes from the battery to your bulb. This is exactly the same thing. Exactly when you push the button, power is coming from a power plant. Some people talk about electric heating, electric vehicles, but exactly when you charge your car, there is a power plant that is delivering this. There is nothing called system or electricity. Electricity is just a transport system. And it's a very fast transport system with more or less the speed of light. 99% of the speed of light or more than that. Okay, so then the question is, you that are sitting in front of me here, you think you hear what I say. This is not correct because it takes around 0.01 second for the sound to move from my mouth to your ears. During that time, the electricity can move from Madrid to Stockholm. So then the question is, which power plant did charge my electric vehicle? And here you directly see the international collaboration here. Just remember this, that when you put your lamp on your bed in the evening, you change the international trading in the Nordic system. Okay, so then the question is about this with stable and reliable. There are some, I will start with one thing, and that is that how much can we trade between each other? This is one of the fundamental issues here. Can we trade? And for example, between northern and southern Sweden have been a discussion because there have been high prices in southern Sweden. And in Sweden, we have 4 different trading areas, while in Germany, they have 1 trading area. So they don't have any formal bottlenecks, but of course, they have as many bottlenecks in Germany as we have in Sweden. So the question is how to handle that. And there is a regulation about this because, of course, if you see it from the Swedish consumer's point of view today, you would like to say that no, it's impossible to export. It's impossible to export to anyone. Okay, then we get a very high surplus in Sweden, and that means that is of course not so nice for let's say for the whole European system. As Thomas mentioned earlier, it's very nice right now because we have a surplus. But I think you mentioned 2003 or something when we were an import country. And of course, if we limit our export, then of course they will also limit the import in another situation. This is one example. I will just show you that this is the transmission limitation. I had a speech for the Svensk näringsliv in Skåne 1.5 years ago, and then I talked about that. And so this is the transmission possibility, as you see here, 5,400 megawatt. Is that what you see to the left? But in reality, it's much lower. So the question is, how are these limits set? and they must be reliable, and there are discussions about how to set these ones. And there are EU regulations around this, how to handle this. What is happening right now in Europe and very much in Sweden is that we are going to change the setup of how to set the limits. The problem with setting the limits today is that SVK and the system operators today, they have to say before 12 o'clock, I mean, yes, 1 hour ago, they had to say exactly how much power you can transmit between different areas and also in Europe tomorrow for each hour. Do they really know what is happening? It may be that we are importing from Norway and exporting to Lithuania, or the opposite, we are importing from Poland and exporting to Denmark. And that has an impact on how much you can transmit between SE3 and SE4. So because of that, we are now moving to something called flow-based, and it's currently operating in parallel in the Nordic system. This is one example which I have shown. This is from December 2021. The purple line on the top, that is how much we really transmitted between the different areas, while the yellow line, this is between SE2 and SE3, while the yellow line is what SVK said the day before, how much you can transport. What you see where I have the arrows there is that we could in reality transport 500 megawatt more than was really let to the market before. Here you see a challenge and it's the yellow line that has an impact on the prices, because it's the day-ahead market that is setting the prices. So the question is here, why didn't we put the purple line from the beginning? Then we had not so high price differences. And this is something that we are trying to improve now, both in Sweden and in the Nordic region, about how to handle these situations in order to get the market having as much power as possible. Another issue about, yes, this is about adequacy. There is a discussion now about how many reserve plants can you have. As you know, in Sweden, which has been a rather big discussion, is about Karlshamns oil-fired power station. This is partly paid in something in Swedish called effektreserv. In the terminology in EU, it's a strategic reserve. And the SVK is paying for this unit in order to keep it there because we need it as a reserve, and then it has been operated rather much. Okay, why does it operate? I studied 2021. There was production during 785 hours. During 776 hours, there were export from SE4 to the neighboring countries on the transmission line with more capacity in reality than this unit produced. This means that you have a state-subsidized unit, or a TSO subsidized, or by the consumers in reality, that makes this unit possible to make money on export. And this is, of course, a discussion here that, of course, how many subsidized units should we have? There are then regulations around this, and the regulation has been in such way that the Energy Inspectorate in Sweden have to define, you can only, for the future, you are only allowed to subsidize this unit if you can show that they are needed. That was a problem, because what do you define with needed? The Energy Inspectorate defined it as it's okay to have 1 hour per year around, or less than 0.1 hour, I think, to have a capacity deficit, because then you will get also very high prices. And so because of that, we cannot subsidize that unit in the future. So there is a discussion right now because assume that the Swedish citizens could subsidize Swedish units, which makes, of course, our system very reliable, and then we have subsidized units that are competing on an international market, which is not okay. So there are certainly a lot of regulation around this. So there are any capacity mechanism, which is, for example, the strategic reserve that we have in Sweden, not go beyond what is necessary to address the adequacy concerns referred to in Article 20. I mean, I cannot, of course, not go into all the details about the regulation here, but you are only allowed to subsidize units in one country if you can show that it's really needed to be subsidized in that country. Okay, then we have the electricity balancing. Watch my time. Okay. There is an imbalance, and that is going to be changed. Currently in Sweden, it's the TSO, which is the Svenska Kraftnät, and in Norway, Statnät and so on. And they are formally today responsible to keep the balance from second to second within each hour. And they have to purchase reserves, so everything that is happening within the hour can be balanced. This is now going to be changed to 15 minutes. Partly because of EU. I mean, when EU decides things, it's of course that the TSO, we have an organization in Europe called ENTSO-E, where you have the European transmission system operator meet together and they have an idea about how to improve the market. What we will see in the future, this is going on, is that we are going to trade per 15 minutes instead. When you're performing balancing, 15 minutes balancing, this means, of course, that it's the power companies that have to pay if they cannot fulfill exactly how much they are going to produce during a 15-minute break. This means that you are going to move the costs from being a TSO, a system cost, to being the actor cost instead, if they cannot handle their balances. For example, wind power today, which have some kind of problems to keep their balance because the forecasts are not perfect, they are today paying for their imbalances, which means that they think that they could produce so much. In reality, they produce much less or much more. So that imbalance they have to pay for, and in addition to that, currently there is an imbalance fee just because they want to promote these kind of units to make better forecasts. So they are paying today for the imbalances, but in the future they also have to pay for the imbalances for each 15 minutes. 15 minutes trading you already have today in, for example, Germany. These are the imbalance costs that we had in Sweden last year in 2022. This is what is happening. I will go into details what this is. This is how to keep the balance within each hour, and it works like this, that each producer and each retailer, they are in reality selling, they are paying a fee to SVK in order to and then SVK is purchasing these kind of balancing services. It's a huge amount of things. It's FRR, FCRD up, and so on. So I will come back in a while. First, the left figure there, that is what they thought will happen. I think it was in a system report from 2021. But now then what really happened in 2022, it was that instead of 2,800 million, it became 6,500 million crowns. And the reason is, of course, that if you are keeping a hydropower plant as reserve, if something is happening, then of course you want to be paid for not using it, because if you are using it, you are earning a huge amount of money because of the high prices. So to keep reserves will, so of course, also become more expensive when the prices go up on the market. Anyhow, these costs were around 5 öre per kilowatt hour distributed on all Swedish consumers, and that was for 2022. So if it was according to the forecast, it has been around 2.2 öre per kilowatt hour. So these are extremely important issues, how to keep the continuous balance in the system, but it's in reality very small money. There seems to be a discussion that we have to move this money around in all these services and make it completely change, and that we change the competition in the market or something. This is small money, but it's extremely important how it is handled. These are the different services. I will just talk a little about of them. First, we have this that has been very much discussed, svängmassa in Swedish, or that is FFR. That is something that is system services that is handled when we have very low inertia in the power system, because we need these kind of machines as the system is set up right now in order to keep the balance in the system. That is this FFR, which is a rather small money. And then we have FCRD up, which is this blue one, a bit longer down. That is the reserves in order to keep when we have a big outage, for example, when we had this stop in Forsmark after the grid problem that we had. Then we need to have reserves. So the big costs is in reality not the FFR. The big cost is in reality to keep margins when we have outages in big power plants. This is just to show you, and that is a bit connected to what Kajsa will talk about then. This is the so-called FFR. That is what we are doing in order to, when we have problems in not so much inertia in the system. That is not handled with power plants. This is completely handled with consumer. And that means that in order to keep the balance, we are disconnecting consumers when we have a very fast decrease in the frequency. This is mainly in the summer, and to be even more specific, it's mainly in weekends, Sunday and Saturday and Sunday nights in the summer. If, for example, a nuclear power station, let's say Oskarshamn 3, is have an outage in a night between Saturday and Sunday in August, then we have problems in the system, and then this FFR is needed. And if you look on the ones that are putting bids here, it's the Norway. They are putting aluminium melters. We have East Denmark, it's large electric boilers. Swedish is battery and electric boilers. And in Finland is also greenhouses, which is one of the very interesting flexible demands that we have in the system. So there is currently, my time is out? Soon, okay. There are, on the other hand, there are two system services that you asked me to talk about, and that is reactive power and inertia, because they are currently not in this system. You are not paid for your inertia, and you are not paid to get voltage support. Inertia means that you have a big rotating machine, which of course contributes to the system, and voltage support is that we need to have a voltage in the system. And there is a discussion that this should in some way be handled. First of all, this FFR, which is in reality, which shows in reality the marginal cost of having low inertia in the system, it's extremely small money. It's, I think 2022, the cost for FFR was 57 million, which is really nothing compared to 6,500 millions. So it's extremely small money where we are discussing this with FFR. But it's extremely important. No matter with that, but from economic point of view, it's a very small thing. Inertia is certainly needed. Voltage support is another thing, and that is the word reactive power that you talked about. Yes, this is also as important. Of course, when we have a sudden outage in Forsmark, as you saw, we didn't get a blackout, very nice. Because we got when we had these outages 2 weeks ago, it could have been a blackout because the system was not dimensioned for that. Also, 1 month ago or 2 months ago, we had an outage on a transmission line between Norway and Germany that could also have. I mean, if we had followed only the dimensioning rules, we had had a blackout. So we should have had 2 blackouts this spring, but we didn't get it because we had even more margins that we are deciding for. This is one example of voltage control. That is E.ON had a place, it's called Nysätra-klustret, Nysätra cluster, where in reality there is a big 130 kV grid which is connected to SVK in a certain point, and SVK want to have voltage support in that point. Otherwise they are not allowing this kind of grid. And because of that, then E.ON constructed a system with a huge amount that wind power contribute with reactive power, and they are controlling in reality the phase angle between the voltage and the current, to take details. And then we also have reactive components as capacitors and inductors. But now I stop. Thank you.
Thank you. I think he deserves an applause. He illustrated, it is a bit complicated, but it's doable. It's important, but it's reasonably well handled. What you did not say, you talked about the 1 hour period and the role of SVK within that hour, and then possibly quarter.
We are tightening it up, yes.
The market and the responsibility of the market actors handles the full hour, but not these details within, and then also the full 15-minute period. So each producer makes a bid the day before.
Today, yes.
No, and will then be obliged to fulfill the balance, to fulfill that delivery. And the retailers, they have contracts with consumers and have a balanced responsibility. If they fail to deliver what they promised to deliver, SVK will correct that and then send the bill to the failing party. So they're all have strong incentives to manage the balance over the hour, but within the hour, TSO has to make these small adjustments and divide the costs up. I don't think we have time for a question now, so we'll do that when we come to the final discussion. Instead, I will now hand over to Kajsa Bartosz, who will talk about the way the market provides incentives for energy efficiency, and that is indeed just as important as efficient distribution of supply. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Kajsa Bartosz, and contrary to what was said in the program, I am an associate professor and docent in industrial engineering and management at Uppsala University. As my name may not be as well known as Lennart's, for instance, I took the liberty of preparing a presentation of my research group as well. How do I? Uh-huh.
There we go.
Do I need to do something to put it in presentation mode or something?
I think it is. There we go.
Yes, thank you. So I'm also leading an interdisciplinary research group. As such, we tend to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches, and we also commonly combine applied and theoretical approaches which comes with our extensive collaboration with the surrounding society and also with other research environments, among those the strategic, I'm not sure I know the English word for this, strategiskt forskningsområde, strategic research area, Stand Up for Energy, and a program that is funded by the Family Kamprad Foundation that is called Smart Grids for the Many People. So what we do have in common is in this interdisciplinary group is that we tend to focus on user perspectives on the energy transition, even more so on smart grids, and with a very particular focus on flexibility. So this is us, the core of the user group. Most of us belong to the area civil and industrial engineering and psychology, but we are also growing in the areas of information technology and statistics. Okay. So I'm going to start from the beginning by setting the scene, which is probably more or less a popular science version of what you've heard from Thomas and Lennart. On top of the agenda is, of course, mitigating climate change. An important part of this is, as you all know, the energy transition. The strategy here is to phase out fossil fuels by using even more electricity than we do today. And in order for this to work, of course, we need to produce this electricity in a clever way. We need to increase the amount of renewables in the system. This means that we are moving from one system that means centrally produced, large centrally produced producing units, and moving towards a more decentralized system where we also want to see more local production, primarily using renewables then, of course. Following this is that these energy resources are more intermittent, and it also means that we need more capacity in the grids. All of this is extremely time-consuming, and time is what we do not have. It is also very costly, and for this reason, flexibility in the system is increasing in importance. And one means of this is so-called demand response, which is more or less another word for flexibility, which is the focus of my research group, as I said. So I'm starting with one of many definitions of demand response, but this is one of the Swedish Energy Markets Inspectorate from 2016, which states that demand response is a voluntary change in the demand for electricity from the grid during a shorter or longer period as a result of some kind of incentive. And it's important to note here that we are talking about electricity from the grid and not to the amount you actually consume. So what is then demand response? How does it work in practice? Well, it can be achieved indirectly or directly or manually or automated. It can also, what I mean by indirect and direct is that it could be incentivized by spot price contracts or the power grid tariff, or it could also be incentivized by a prepaid compensation for an act that is activated when necessary. We talk about flexibility resources, and they could be more or less anything that can be reduced, where power can be reduced or shifted in time, or occasionally it can also even be relevant to increase consumption to balance the system. It could also be achieved top-down, in that case managed by an aggregator, a market actor that can offer flexibility in the flexibility markets that are emerging now, or more traditionally bottom-up than controlled by individual users, indirectly or directly. So in order for all of this to happen, we are very dependent on smart grids and smart technology, and development in this area is very rapid. On the other hand, my research group worked from the starting point that this development and the use of this technology is very much dependent on the users. So by that I mean that the speed of the energy transition is dependent on the willingness to invest in those, and the willingness and acceptance for being controlled by an aggregator or to engage in these kind of activities themselves. So in the European vision of the future sustainable energy system, the transition to a sustainable energy efficient, low fossil and climate smart economy demands a more decentralized and open system involving the whole society. In future energy systems, customers need to be at the center of things. This is from 2017, but it very much reflects any EU policy document still today. The problem is that this is not so much reflected in what is actually happening out there. That we as electricity consumers are not so much aware of this vision. So I'm moving to some results from my own research and some experience with demand response programs that then aim to incentivize this kind of behavior, shift in electricity use for the purpose of balancing the system. So our experience from this area, extremely short now, but in this case, from an experiment with including power tariffs, comparing understanding, knowledge, and so on between electricity consumers with a traditional energy-based tariff and those who for a fairly long time have had a power tariff. So the results tell us that households actually have a fairly good understanding of both the concepts energy and power. There were no significant difference in this respect. Because this is often presented as one barrier to introducing demand response programs, that it would be more difficult to understand the concept of power, but this seems not actually to be the case. They also have a fairly good ability to transform this information into useful and relevant behavioral changes from the system point of view. And the study also showed that there is a learning curve here. So if you have had this power tariff for some time, and you also are aware that you are actually having this, then there is a significant increase in understanding of the concepts, but also what would be a relevant behavior in this context. So the very problem here is that households tend to have an extremely poor knowledge of what tariff they actually have. So in the case of Sollentuna, for instance, where they have had this power tariff for more than 20 years, still less than 20% actually were aware of this fact. And then, of course, you cannot expect a great effect of this. So the conclusions we draw from this is that the potential for increasing demand response actually is high, and that the challenge is then more related to communication than to understanding of the tariff.
Thank you. So a long-term ambition from the EU and others. Technologies have evolved in a direction making this easier, because not only have we got hourly power tariffs available, the information technology necessary to automatically manage power variations has also improved. And I think we have both picked up rumors about some of the very successful applications of this opportunity last year, when the power price variation over the day was very high, especially in southern Sweden, where some people who had invested in control technologies really saved a lot of money by allocating the consumption over time.
Yes. Do you want me to comment on that? Yes. Well, I have an ongoing project with Engenic, a company offering a product that entails the possibility to automatically control heat pumps. And in the beginning of this project, we struggled hard to spread this product in order to be, from our perspective, to be able to study the effects, of course. 1.5 years later, they queued up for this product. So it's very obvious that something happened.
So last year saw a crisis, but it was also very educational and accelerated a lot of desirable developments. Now we have to give the floor to Elaine O'Connell, or give the screen to Elaine O'Connell, who we have not seen so much of, but hope we will get a full screen picture of her now.
Hello, good afternoon.
Elaine, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. And I will just share now my screen. I think your technician might need to give me permission to share my screen. In the meantime, I could maybe take the opportunity from Brussels to congratulate Sweden on winning the Eurovision Song Contest at the weekend. It was a great show, and although as an Irish person, I suppose we're not so happy that we're not the only country anymore to win 7 times. But if we have to share the record with somebody, I'm happy it's Sweden. Okay. I'm going to try again to share my screen. I'm afraid it's still not possible.
Senior technician on his way. Yes, there we go.
Okay. Ah, yes, excellent. So I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we see it.
That's great. Okay. So I've just moved to full screen mode, so you should see that in just a moment.
We now see presenters mode, so we see your next slide as well.
Okay, okay. I'm just going to maybe change a setting here. Okay, I'm afraid I'll have to leave it like that, but I hope it works fine. So I'm very happy to be here today, and I was very impressed actually by the level of detail by the previous presenters. So I won't have to go into too much detail here, I think, because it's already been an excellent introduction. I'd like to maybe focus on the developments in the market, the energy market, in particular the gas market, and the effect that that has had on electricity over the last 2 to 3 years. So the slide I'm showing you here is about the EU's import dependency. I think we've all heard a lot about it, but I think the figures are quite startling. That in 2021, we were very highly dependent on gas imports from Russia, and also, but also for coal and oil. So we have been working hard to respond to the crisis in many ways. So as we all know, we started to see the prices rising in 2021. This was as the economy was restarting after COVID, but also there were the hydropower was quite dry in Europe, and also with the French nuclear. The nuclear fleet had some problems around that time. And so all of this contributed to higher prices. And what we saw around that time, still in 2021, was that as the prices were going higher, we were not getting more imports of gas from Russia, which you would normally expect in a time, you know, if the market dynamics were working well. So there was already something in 2021 that wasn't quite right. And then the Commission published a toolbox explaining what measures member states could take in order to address the high prices. So a lot of the issue came because a lot of member states are quite dependent on gas to generate electricity. And those member states in particular that had a lot of gas-fired power stations, they found that their prices were going very, very high. And then I'm just going to highlight a couple of elements here. So you see then after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there was quite a serious effort on the part of the EU to address this and to address our dependence on Russia, because this is what we saw was going to be a strategic issue for us. So on the 18th of May, the Repower EU plan was published. And also in June was the adoption of the gas storage regulation, which meant that member states were obliged to have the gas storage filled to certain levels. In September of that same year, in July then again, there was also the gas demand reduction measure where member states were obliged to not only have the storage quite full, but also to take measures to reduce gas consumption. And then on the 14th of December, there was an emergency proposal on the electricity market. And there's maybe something that will be of interest to Sweden on that point. As part of this measure, there's a feature of the electricity market, which means that if there's a large price difference between two zones, so for example, between the Swedish zone 1 and 2 in the north, and then zone 3 and 4 in the south are usually higher priced. So there's a lot of renewables in the north and a lot of demand in the south. And so there's quite often a high price difference, especially between SE2 and SE3, for example. And so the difference in those prices then goes to the TSO for something that's called congestion income. And then the TSO uses that income to reduce the congestion. So to build more lines, which means that you can import more of the renewables from the north to the south, and also for other elements, other uses. But this is one of the main ones, that this congestion income should be used to reduce congestion and benefit consumers. So because of the very high price differences last year, and the Swedish TSO in particular, and because of the different trading areas in Sweden, had quite a lot of these congestion revenues. And so under this emergency regulation, it's also been enabled now that some of that revenue can go back to consumers and households. And actually the Swedish government introduced that. It was a state aid measure, and the decision was published by the Commission just, I think, about 10 days ago. So it's available on the DG Competition website if you're interested in having a look. And so a lot of those revenues now will be channeled back to consumers, but also the TSO has increased its efforts and increased the ambition of some of the infrastructure projects in order to be able to bring more of the cheaper priced electricity from the north to the south. So in this Repower EU plan that was published in 2022, what are the objectives there? So one of the main objectives was to reduce our dependency on Russia, which is especially important for security of supply, but also to boost energy efficiency, roll out renewables more quickly. Also, looking at the issue of energy poverty, which became much more into the spotlight with the rising electricity prices and the rising consumer bills. Incentivizing the reduction of energy demand was another, and also to address bottlenecks, because what we need as part of our response to this is more domestic generation and less reliance on imports. And so in order to do that, we need to build up the grids to be able to handle more renewables, but we also need to build up the connections between EU member states, because it won't always be windy and always be sunny in certain member states. We need to share this electricity. I'll come back to that again in later slides. Another element to note here is that green and digital skills are an area that we think can be a growth area for the economy. We expect about 160,000 new jobs to be created just through these areas alone. Just through the green transition, when we were looking at all of the elements for our offshore strategy, for example, we can create hundreds of thousands of new jobs through these areas. And 2023 is the European Year of Skills. So there's a lot of initiatives and conferences taking place this year in order to make sure that we're well prepared for this transition. So was it successful, all of our efforts in 2022 to reduce consumption? I think you can see here that it was. We have seriously reduced our dependence on Russian gas imports. This is on the pipeline imports. But also, if you just look at the internal EU results and achievements, we have managed to reduce our gas demand. We also actually reduced our electricity demand. That was part of a separate emergency regulation. And we also met all of our storage filling obligations. And those obligations are ongoing. So it's also the case for 2023 that we have gas storage filling obligations. And I'm happy to say that all member states are on track for meeting their obligations also now for 2023. But still in 2023, there are more initiatives coming. And I'm just highlighted the key ones here. The renewables legislation, this Fit for 55 legislation. So that's a 55% reduction in carbon emissions. And then also to be more prepared ahead of winters. The electricity market design, which I'll go into in more detail in a couple of minutes. To create a hydrogen bank, and also to improve the governance framework. So how all of this will be brought together. So I want to highlight a couple of elements because there's very recent development. Just last month, the target for our renewables target for 2030 has been increased. It's increased from 41%, I say here 45, but officially it's 42.5% between the member states, and that's binding. And then there's a voluntary extra 2.5%. To try take it to 45. And so in order to enable this, we're going to need to see a rapid rollout of renewable energy. And then another very innovative initiative is Aggregate EU, which is an common EU purchasing platform for gas. And that is I think we've already registered about 76 companies for this, and during the summer already they will issue the first tenders for joint purchase of gas on the worldwide market. So using the EU's bargaining power in order to try achieve economies of scale on our gas purchasing power. So now coming on to the electricity market design, which is the main focus and the main topic that we've heard about so far today. The Commission has published a proposal in March on how we can reform the electricity market design. What we were really considering, what can we take as the lessons learned from the crisis, from the energy transition, from the emergency intervention last year that was published, and how can we make changes in the long term for the benefit of consumers? So the first thing to say is that we also had a public consultation on this, and there was a very strong support for the way the short-term markets work. So this marginal pricing system that Lennart mentioned. And why is that? Well, it's because it ensures the most efficient dispatch of the system all around Europe. It ensures that the cheapest plants are always dispatched first, which of course favors variable renewables as well. So it means that we use all the renewables on the system first before other plants are then dispatched. But it also helps to ensure security of supply. We already heard the case about France, and France is normally an electricity exporter with all of its nuclear fleet. But last year it became an importer. We also saw last summer for it was late summer 2021, for about 3 or 4 days, the Baltics became importers as well. The price went very high, but just for a couple of days because they had unexpected outages. And so in this way, when the price goes high, it attracts imports, and that can ensure security of supply. And so it's really the way that the market supports security of supply. We also, incidentally, had a very difficult winter in Belgium in 2018, and there were very serious concerns about security of supply because of some problems with the nuclear fleet here as well. And in the end, there were no outages because Belgium was a net importer for that entire winter. And what would have been the case if we couldn't rely on the markets in that way? It would mean that extra power plants would need to be built in every country, paid for by consumers, when actually it's more efficient to share this energy around Europe. This flexibility, this interconnection is becoming more important because it allows us to share renewables then across a wider area. So the more interconnected the market is, the more renewables the more the system can handle renewables over a wider area. So there was a consensus that the short-term markets work in the public consultation, but there was also a strong need that came out of this, that a lot of EU legislation over the last 10, 20 years has focused on making these short-term markets work well and ensuring that they support security of supply, but there hasn't really been a focus on the long-term markets. It was also important to keep in mind about that we need both public and private investments in order to make the energy transition work. So investor certainty is also key. And we need to make sure that private investors have a certainty on the way the market will work as well to continue with their investments. And so as part of that as well, there was a strong, I would say, resistance from a lot of people on making emergency measures and regular emergency tools a key part of the market, that this was really an emergency and now we've dealt with it and we should take the lessons learned and implement more structural changes in the long term. So the objective of the reform then would be to better protect and empower consumers. Here we heard the example that in Sweden people often have longer term contracts. That's not the case in quite a lot of Europe. And so as part of this reform now, consumers should be offered both variable contracts and long-term contracts as well to give the consumer more choice. And there's also particular provisions there about when vulnerable households could be protected by some regulated prices in case of an emergency like the one we saw last year. And also to enhancing the stability and predictability of the cost of energy. This is working on long-term markets, and I'll come into a bit more detail on that. Accelerating the integration of renewables with flexibility sources. We heard from the previous speaker how important that's going to be to ensure that we have this flexibility in the system. Already in the evenings between about 4 and 8, that's already a peak time on the system. But in 10 years, if everybody comes during those hours and also plugs in their electric vehicle, that will put a lot of strain on the system. So actually, it's much better to try use the system as efficiently as we can and make sure that we have these time incentives right, which is exactly what the previous speaker was talking about. And then also there's a need to ensure that we've got the right surveillance tools, and that's this REMIT regulation, which stands for the Regulation on energy market integrity and transparency. So we are also updating that to make sure that it's fit for purpose with modern day electricity trading. So some of the elements here, I won't spend too long on these because there's a lot of details, but I'll just highlight maybe some key elements that are related to the discussions today. So in terms of better consumer protection and empowerment, we're proposing the right to have fixed price contracts and have longer term contracts, but also to enable energy sharing between families. And I think that's a very interesting one, and it really fits with the sense of local ownership that we need to foster in order to make sure that we have public support for the energy transition. And also, I'll just point out here the right to multiple contracts, because you might decide that actually for everything else, I want to stick with my electricity contract, but for my new electric vehicle, I want a new contract with a particular supplier, because they will tell me when it's cheap to use my electric vehicle and when it's cheap to charge it. And so there's a right here to multiple contracts. So you could stick with your existing supplier for everything else, and then choose maybe for your electric vehicle or something else that you would like to have a different supplier and a different contract. And then here, this element here about PPAs, CFDs, and forward markets, this is about developing long-term markets. So creating contracts for renewables over a 20-year period, so they get the revenue certainty, but they also don't get these very high market prices then from hour to hour or in the moment of a crisis, because they don't perhaps need it in the long term. What they need is long-term price stability. What consumers want is long-term price stability. And so with this market reform, we're trying to foster this idea that that the price can be fixed well in advance. So both from the government-backed contracts for difference possibly, but also through private PPAs. And then in terms of the forward markets, this is how far in advance you can trade across borders. And at the moment, that really only works up to about a year. It works a bit better in the Nordics because you have this EPAD, this price area differentials. And so what we're trying to do is take some of the best practice from the Nordics and roll that out. So there's, of course, always some EU jargon involved. So we call these virtual hubs, but actually it's taking the best practice of the EPADs from the Nordics. And also, very interestingly, in February in 2023, Svenska Kraftnät introduced a new product whereby they're also offering transmission rights. And this has seen a huge increase in liquidity in the Swedish market. And this is a best practice that we're trying to roll out now as part of the market reform. It's very much inspired by the Swedish experience.
You'll have to finish off fairly fast now.
Okay. And so then just very quickly then to finish, there's also measures in there to enable flexibility support schemes if member states see that enough flexibility is not coming forward. And also to support the development of offshore renewable energy projects that are connected to several markets. And then in order to ensure that the market is better monitored, and to make sure that we have the tools that are fit for purpose, because electricity trading has changed quite a lot since we had this original market surveillance legislation. So I'm happy to take any questions. I think maybe just to really highlight the impact that the Nordic model has had on the rest of Europe. We've really seen a way that you can cooperate with the neighbours, share energy. I think we all understand that we've had a price crisis in the last year, but actually it could easily have been a security of supply crisis, and it didn't turn into that. So we need to take the lessons learned, which is that being integrated is a good thing because it protects our security of supply. But in terms of prices, there are things that we can certainly improve, and that's all part now of the Commission's that's part of the Commission's proposal at the moment. So where it stands now is that the member states are discussing it under the remit of the Swedish presidency, and we expect to have a member state position hopefully before the end of the Swedish presidency, but let's see how that goes. And the Parliament is also discussing it now, so that a lot of the MEPs have become involved, and we hope to have a Parliament position on that also in the next few months. And then the negotiations will start between the Parliament and the member states and the Council. And then hopefully we'll have a final regulation by the end of the year. So we really hope that we can have this in place before next winter and by the end of the year. And with that, I would just like to say thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this reform here.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you. I think many in the room appreciated the way you used domestic for the common European assets. Many in Sweden have emphasized domestic as something very national in the last year. It's also interesting to hear you emphasize the importance of surveillance of how the electricity market works, so there's no market manipulation creating undue profits, and the way you see the importance of the long-term market or price forward prices and so on for investors and customers to increase their security of investment. I think those are indeed important points that deserve attention. Now we had the schedule 15 minutes for discussion. The 15 minutes have almost passed, but I suggest that the two speakers in the room come up to the front and we will have a few minutes for discussion of the various issues brought up with questions from the audience, and you can get a microphone so Elaine can hear the question as well.
Jens Pettersson, thank you for your presentations. Taking into consideration the transparency of marginal energy prices, how much higher must the European energy price go to motivate the investment in refurbing North Stream? The answer to this question contributes to the international peace negotiations if and when they will be held with the next generation of Russian leadership.
Right. Anyone who would like to try to answer that question? I understand the point, but I don't think the answer is very easy to put forward.
A question also, you talked about the next generation Russian leaders.
Yeah.
When is that?
Yeah, we don't know. But it's still an interesting technical question. I've heard some arguing that the pipelines that are actually open to the brackish seawater now, they will not be easily repaired. But others claim, well, the pipeline itself might be useful. There are other installations along the route that need to be exchanged. But I don't think any of us can answer that question. But indeed, it's an interesting one. Any other questions from the room? Måns at the front.
Thanks for all the presentations. I have a question which relates to Lennart Sörre's presentation, but also to the others, and that is, it's a complex technical system. On top of that, it's a complex legal system, and on top of those two systems, there are a small number of actors that trade with each other. Now, how big is the risk for manipulation in all this? And is the surveillance good enough so that manipulation is actually avoided?
I think in manipulation you have two things. One is, of course, investments, and the other one is operation. I think in operation you have rather good competition. What do you say? I think so. Mm-hmm. But I mean, of course, the challenge is, for what I know, is that there have been a lot of discussion about how to check that. And there, for example, in California, they have checked this with manipulation, because there it's easier, because all the power plants are more or less built on, you can know the efficiencies and so on. The problem in the Nordic system is the hydropower, which is extremely difficult, because different hydropower owners can have different estimations of how much is my water valued. And the problem with that is that you cannot say that they are wrong or they are right. For example, Vattenfall have always been accused to use their water in the wrong way, because they may think that we will save the water because it can be a huge amount of late spring flood and so on, so we should keep the water. And then people say that, why do you keep the water? Why don't you release it in August so we get low prices? On the other hand, the question, if they release it and then they come to the spring and there's no water in the reservoirs, and then, okay, you release it best because you wanted so high prices in the spring. I mean, what is correct? I mean, it's extremely difficult to have any kind of surveillance on especially hydropower, I think.
Which means there is room for manipulation.
Exactly, there is. But the question is that, that's a challenge.
Elaine, you pointed out that the European Commission had noted that better monitoring of the electricity market was important. Can you give some details on what you see as important issues?
So I think the main issue is that the way we trade electricity in the last 10 years has changed significantly with the rollout of market coupling, and in particular flow-based market coupling. And some of the data collection that we have is maybe not fit for purpose. And also because we've become more interconnected, when it's also about governance. How do you manage those cross-border investigations? How can you work with Acer? Where should Acer have a role, where not? And so there's a lot of these discussions happening now about what should be the cross-border nature. And I think that's where we see more the challenge, that because at domestic level, the regulators are very capable of doing that. But when you have cross-border issues, we need to make sure that we can also track that. But there is a system. There is a system in place for flagging suspected risky trades or suspected unusual trades, and anybody can go onto the system and flag that if you see some unusual behavior. And then for the rest, it's about making sure that we have the right data collection tools and the right rules in place to allow cross-border investigations.
Indeed, but we should be very happy that there is cross-border trade, because if we had only an isolated Swedish electricity system, then the concentration on the supply side would have been too high. After the re-regulation of the market in the 1990s, there was quite a bit of the power companies bought each other, and the number of actors decreased. And I had some correspondence with the competition authority at the time, trying to explain that you could not use the same measures of concentrations as with products that can be stored because of this second balancing requirement on the electricity market. And I was quite frustrated by their lack of understanding for this particular feature of the electricity market. And then I reused the joke from a British comedian complaining that, why is there only one competition authority?
I remember, that's a good joke, I'll remember that.
Okay, we should stop.
We should.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Elaine from Brussels, and thank you, Kajsa, Thomas, and Lennart for this very informative and very useful information. I hope that many people will look at it at YouTube channel, because this is information that they all need, and I think we don't know so much about, really, as you said before. Thank you for coming. I'm Eva Hedlund, the president of the Svenska Europarörelsen, the European movement. And now I will turn to Swedish, if you are okay, Elaine. Jag vill bara påminna om att om en vecka, den 22 nästa vecka, har Svenska Europarörelser ett panelsamtal om valet i Turkiet. Då kommer före detta ambassadören Mikael Salin och Emma Bovin, som är Mellanöstern-korrespondent för Dagens Nyheter, och pratar om vad är det som står på spel nu när det blir en andra omgång i det turkiska valet. Tack för att ni kom, och jag hoppas vi ses snart igen.